Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave, and this third video on the topic of creation and evolution. The topic of this video is biological taxonomy, and allow me a minute to explain why I picked this topic. In the first video I did on creation and evolution, I mentioned that I would make the first several videos about less controversial topics, but also more fundamental issues, and biological taxonomy fits into that category. I have read and seen a lot of arguments back and forth between creationists and evolutionists, and often the topic of biological taxonomy is present, but in the background. For example, most creationists will happily admit that species can change over the course of generations, but they will also say that there is a limit to how much a species can change. The next obvious questions are, of course, well, how much can they change? And where is this proposed limit? Then, if a creationist is educated and bold enough to answer that question with any kind of precision, the reply will involve taxonomy. And of course, taxonomy also comes up when asking questions about Noah's Ark. See my video on Gilgamesh and which animals he was supposed to bring on board. Additionally, in the field of biology, at least since Darwin, there has been an effort to make taxonomy and evolutionary descent match up, to let there be a feedback loop between having evolutionary lines of descent determine a species' position in the taxonomic system, and vice versa, to let the species' taxonomic classification be a starting point for determining its evolutionary history, one constantly refining the other. So that is why I believe that delving into biological taxonomy, understanding its purpose, its history, its terminology, how it's used in practice, and which debates are currently ongoing between philosophers of biology and biologists will help us to understand much more about the topic of creation and evolution in the future. And since I'm a biblical scholar, I will also include a section on biblical taxonomy and how the Bible classifies living things. What is taxonomy? Taxonomy is based on two Greek words, taxis and nomia, arrangement and method. So when we are talking about biological taxonomy, it is about how we methodologically arrange living things. Or to put it differently, it is the method by which organisms are systematically described, classified, arranged, and named, based upon which they are placed in a group or a taxon. This way of defining taxonomy makes it distinct from a closely related field with which it is sometimes merged, namely systematics. In systematics, an organism is indeed taxonomically classified, but then also classified or described based on its natural relatedness to other organisms, and an analysis of the variation and evolution of the taxa. To briefly illustrate the difference, let's look at a domesticated cat. Taxonomy would say that its species is Felis catus, from the genus of Felis, the family of Felids, the order of carnivores, the class of mammals, the phylum of chordates, the kingdom of animals, and the domain of eukaryotes. What any of these things mean, we'll see later in the video, but so far this was all taxonomy. In comes systematics, which might say something like that the domesticated cat is naturally or evolutionarily more closely related to the cheetah than to dogs, because cheetahs are in the same family, while dogs are merely in the same order. And dogs are naturally or evolutionarily more closely related to cats than they are to whales, because they merely share a class, etc., etc. Additionally, systematics can include things like an analysis of the genetic variation occurring within a single species, or a description of phenotypical variation within such a group. By the way, phenotypical means a description of physical characteristics, which makes it distinct from genotypical, which only looks at genes. Phenotypical characteristics include height, weight, and color, but also bone structure, diet, and manner of reproduction. Both of these, the genotypical and the phenotypical analysis, are usually done with an eye on environmental adaptation. So as you can see, taxonomy, systematics, and evolutionary analysis spend a lot of time interacting with each other, with all three activities influencing one another. And this three-way marriage is one of the most important reasons why biologists are often so baffled by creationists when they want to put a limit on how far evolution goes. Because taxonomy is everywhere, and wherever taxonomy goes, their systematics and evolutionary analysis follow. In fact, according to some definitions of taxonomy, it is identical to systematics, or in some cases it should even follow after systematics and evolutionary analysis, underscoring how closely related these terms are in the minds of biologists, and in the way they are practically applied in research. For creationists among my listeners, try to put yourself in their shoes and see how bewildering it must sound to separate these three things. It is like asking a linguist to fully separate grammar from syntax, or to ask a painter to fully separate form from color, or a football coach to fully separate tactics from strategy. It can be done, but if you're not used to it, it will take some real mental effort and a lot of charity towards the one asking you to do so. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's first ask the question what the point of taxonomy is by itself, so independent of systematics and evolution. Anyone who looks at nature will find a large variety of organisms, and if your mother tongue hadn't already provided names for all kinds of plants, animals and other things, we would surely intuitively start calling these plants and animals by names of our own invention. We could call a dog and a tulip, for example, and we would be on a merry way to name a whole bunch of things. But as we start to pay more attention to things, we begin to notice that some animals are more similar to each other than to others. For example, a horse will look relatively similar to a donkey, but both would look quite different from a giraffe. Yet the horse and the donkey and the giraffe will look more like each other than any of them look like a crocodile. And then all four of those will look more like each other than any of them look like an oak tree. This is when we develop broader, more general terms in our language to describe not just individual organisms, but larger groups. Words like mammals and reptiles, or birds and fish, or plants and insects, to name a few. This type of intuitive classification of larger groups of organisms could be called primitive or intuitive taxonomy. Yet everyday language may not always be used precisely. We all hate that one person who has to point out that a tomato is actually a fruit instead of a vegetable, or that spiders aren't actually insects but arachnida. Yet for biologists, naming things precisely is something that brings them great joy. It helps with making sure they all know what they are talking about. And it also makes communication quicker. It saves a lot of ink to say that a newly discovered species is a mammal, rather than having to say that it gives birth to live young and produces milk to feed the newborn during the first stage of their development, etc., etc., etc. So then, the next question becomes, what is the correct way to do taxonomy? Or what is the correct or best way to categorize living things into groups? And the answer is twofold. First, a taxonomy must be clearly defined and broadly accepted to be helpful in communication. Second, it must serve the purpose it is used for well. So then, what is the purpose of biology? Because whatever the purpose of biology is, that is the purpose that the taxonomy must support. Biology is the study of living organisms. In the first place, for its own sake, and out of a desire to understand the world and how it works. This is important because language and intuitive taxonomy have several words, categories and criteria that serve very different purposes. Think of a word like pets or livestock. Those categorize animals based on whether we like them in our house or whether we want to hold them on a farm and eat them. The history of taxonomy. Before we delve into the modern system of taxonomy, it is helpful to have a brief look at the history of this discipline. One way to divide the history of taxonomy is as follows. 1. Ancients. 2. Early modern. 3. Linnaeus. 4. Darwin. And 5. Contemporary. Let's start with the ancients. Many, and probably all, ancient cultures have intuitively developed names for plants and animals and groups of them. Examples abound, including long catalogues on Egyptian tombs depicting, describing and categorizing plants. Another example would be the ancient Mesopotamians, who, helpfully, created bilingual dictionaries to translate from Sumerian to Akkadian, two languages spoken in that region. These dictionaries include lists of animals that have helped us to understand how they classified and categorized animals. And let's not forget the ancient Chinese, who recorded and categorized hundreds of plants and animals that could be used for medicinal purposes. But almost all of this is based on a human-centered classification system, where a species' usefulness to humans is one of the primary characteristics used for classification. The one major exception is Aristotle and his student Theophrastus. Oh, Aristotle, how everyone both loves and hates you. Most modern academics, in most classical fields of science and humanities, seem to have the same reaction whenever Aristotle comes up. On the one hand, they all have to give grudging credit to this ancient Greek philosopher for being the first to observe or describe something, or the first to offer up a theory about how something works. On the other hand, it seems Aristotle was always wrong about everything. This makes him perhaps the most referenced wrong person in history. So what contribution did Aristotle make to biology and specifically to taxonomy? Here I would like to highlight 4 major contributions that he has been remembered for by taxonomists. First, he looked at all life, even plants, though he wrote more about animals, and he tried to find a way to categorize and systematically describe each and every species he encountered. And he even included a brief discussion on rocks. In his systematic description, he looked at concrete and broad categories of characteristics. Most famously, he looked if an animal had blood or not. Animals with blood he called enhema, and animals without blood he called anhema. A distinction still largely used by biologists today, though they prefer to look at spines rather than blood, so they call them vertebrates and invertebrates instead. Other things he looked at were whether an animal was cold or hot, and whether it was wet or dry. If you have no idea about these two opposites of hot and cold and wet and dry, I suggest you take a look at my video on Anaximander, who used those opposites to explain all of reality, an idea that apparently stuck with Aristotle. Besides that, he also counted legs, investigated modes of reproduction, do they lay eggs or give birth to a live young, and what kind of soul that they have. Rocks had no soul, plants had a vegetative soul, animals had both a vegetative and a sensitive soul, while humans, and only humans, had a vegetative, a sensitive, and a rational soul. All this led to his third contribution, and that is an organization of these organisms from lowest to highest. Obviously, humans were at the top. They were the highest because we have a rational soul, followed by various types of animals. Even lower were plants, and lowest were rocks. Then animals with blood were higher than animals without blood, and warm-blooded animals who were both hot and wet were better than cold-blooded animals who were cold and wet, and so on and so forth. This whole system was called the Scala Naturae, or the ladder of nature, with humans at the top. Later medieval Christians would adapt this into the great chain of being and piously put God at the top, followed by angels and then humans, animals and plants, but the idea remained the same. The fourth idea is something he took from his master Plato, and that is that species of organisms cannot change. They are created to live in their specific environments, and that is why they are like that. This contradicted the idea put forth by some earlier philosophers like Anaximander and Empedocles, who believed that animals can, or at least did, change. But Aristotle believed that they couldn't change because if they were different, they would die, and therefore they couldn't have been different in the past or in the future. There were metaphysical reasons for this belief as well. In Plato, for example, it is related to the world of forms or ideas, and in Aristotle it is related to the theory of 4 causes. But this video is long enough as it is, so I won't get into it. We will get to what the Bible says about taxonomy later on in this video, but let me here already state very clearly for the record. The Bible does not say that species cannot change. Some 18th century scholars read this Aristotelian idea back into the Bible, and even some modern biology textbooks repeat that notion, but it simply isn't the case. Early modern taxonomy. Much of the later medieval period in Europe was dominated by Aristotle in almost every way. Be it in theology, anthropology, astronomy, logic, art or biology, in almost every scientific field of inquiry, it was always Aristotle o'clock. What makes the early modern period, with which I refer to the 16th through the 18th century, so important then, is the fact that Europeans started to break ranks with Aristotle and began to think outside of the box he constructed for them over 2000 years ago. For biology, that meant several things, including a renewed interest in plants, because many biologists from this early period were botanists and began studying plants and placing them in taxonomic systems. The one who is often named the first taxonomist was an Italian physician and botanist named Andrea Cesalpino, who lived from 1519 through 1603. His major work on plants is called De Plantis Libri 16. He described over 1500 species of plants and he systematically ordered them based on their characteristics. He started with dividing plants into 4 categories, namely trees, shrubs, shrubby herbs, and herbs. This fourfold division is often attributed to Aristotle, though his work on plants is sadly lost. Cesalpino then goes on to further subdivide them based on the shape of the flowers, and the fruit, and the number of seeds. He is adamant that only intrinsic characteristics should play a role in classification, not what he called unessential features, like their medicinal purpose or their habitat. Clearly we're making strides in biology. Sometime later, Caspar Bohin from Switzerland, who lived from 1560 through 1624, published his work on botany, in which he, seemingly for the first time, divided plants not just based on large and arbitrary groupings or individual species, but he also used the term genus and frequently referred to plants by their species and genus. Then, almost a century after Cesalpino, we find John Ray, an English botanist who lived from 1627 through 1705. He was hugely influenced by Cesalpino and similarly followed Aristotle's fourfold division. He then went on to divide trees in 8 groups, shrubs in 2, shrubby herbs in 1 and herbs in 21, all based on looking at intrinsic characteristics rather than unessential ones. What John Ray also did was look at more than just the flowers, fruits and seeds, but he also looked at things like the shape of leaves and whether 1 or 2 leaves would first come out of a seed. It is interesting to note that he also believed that there could be deterioration in a species that would distort the characteristics by which it could be classified, and potentially complicating the whole classification process. Now, you might be wondering which intrinsic characteristics of a plant should be prioritized. For example, is it the shape of their leaves, the number of their leaves, their color, their size, their position on the stem or the branch, or should we look at their flowers, or the fruits, or the seeds? Or should we look at all of these things because all of them are important for classification, but then which one had a higher priority and which a lower? In comes August Quirinus Bachmann, or Rivinus, of Rivia? Nah. Anyway, he was a German botanist who lived from 1652 through 1723, and he refused to look at any other part of a plant other than its flowers. And he prioritized the number of petals and whether it was regular or irregular. And in doing so, he introduced a word that would later be picked up and used all the way until today. And that is the word ordines, which can be translated as order. He divided plants in 18 orders and radically did away with Aristotle's fourfold division, because that system was primarily looking at the stem of the plant and not the flower petals. By looking at these characteristics and giving them a certain relative priority, he came up with a system you can see in this diagram, which I copied from someone else. He also followed Bauhin's practice of consistently referring to a species, not just by the species name but also by the name of its genus, a so-called binomial nomenclature, which is standard practice today. So after an Italian, a Swiss, an Englishman and a German, I of course have to mention a Frenchman. Et voilà, here is Joseph Piton de Tournefort. He lived from 1656 through 1708, and his contributions are controversial. But it is clear that he popularized the binomial nomenclature, and also the taxonomic level of class, of which he distinguished 22 among plants. though he uncreatively only numbered them and did not give them fancy Latin names as became fashionable later. On the other hand, he also, seemingly arbitrarily, brought back part of Aristotle's division, but he only distinguished between trees and herbs. His work was hugely influential though, because of its clear language and many beautiful illustrations. In combination with his travels abroad, especially in the Caucasus and the Mediterranean, which allowed him to introduce many plants that were not native to Western Europe. And finally, let me mention two more botanists from this age. First, a German named Rudolf Jakob Camerarius, who lived from 1665 through 1721. He was a strong proponent of looking exclusively at a plant's reproductive organs for classification, and he was famous for being the first person to prove by experimentation that many plants, like animals, have two sexes of male and female. And Pierre Magnol, a French botanist who lived from 1638 through 1715, who introduced the taxonomic rank of family. Linnaeus. So to recap, in early modern times, biologists, especially botanists, started to slowly move away from Aristotle and his classification of plants. All these botanists agreed that it should be intrinsic characteristics of the organisms that would determine the classification, and they started to use terms like species and genus more consistently, and also added layers of order or class or family. However, they were also limited in several ways. First of all, they continued to argue about which characteristics should be prioritized and how many classes, orders or families plants should be divided into. Additionally, they mostly concerned themselves with plants and not with animals. In comes Linnaeus, born in 1707 and he died in 1778, and he is from Sweden. He is sometimes seen as the pinnacle of early modern taxonomy, and he laid the bedrock for our current taxonomical system. Though the way taxonomy is done has changed significantly, his general outline has largely been preserved. Additionally, he formalized and standardized the binomial system by which a species is named, with two Latin names, the genus followed by the species. But more importantly, it wasn't so much what he wrote or how he classified any particular species, but the fact that his system inspired many who followed in his footsteps to use the same tiers and groupings he proposed, at least initially. It is of course no surprise that he spent a lot of time discussing plant classifications, but he also included, for the first time in a long time, a classification system for animals, and even for rocks, likely also inspired by Aristotle. A few things should be noted about this important work. First, this is the first time every living organism is divided up in kingdoms, animals, plants and rocks, but also classes, orders, genera and species. First, this was done briefly, namely the first edition of his Systema Naturae was only 11 pages, but later on it became more and more elaborate, as in his 13th and final published edition, which was published posthumously, was 6,300 pages. Still, his 5-tiered system, later expanded to 8 to include domain, phylum and family, has remained roughly intact. The second thing that should be kept in mind is the notion that this classification system was perceived to be a description of the system of nature itself, which in turn was a system created by God. In that view, the task of taxonomy is not to create an artificial classification system, but to describe the naturally occurring order that merely needs to be discovered. The third and fourth point are that Aristotle is still not fully out of the rearview mirror, since both his notion of unchanging species and his notion of a hierarchical structure have not been done away with. This fourth point can be illustrated by the fact that Linnaeus' Systema Naturae starts with animals, followed by plants, and finally rocks. And within animals, he starts with quadrupeds, or four-limbed animals, and then birds, amphibians, fish, insects, and worms, an order that closely follows Aristotle's. And among the class of four-limbed animals, the order of humanoids is first, and in the order of humanoids, the genus and species of humans is first. And among humans, in some editions at least, white Europeans are first. Okay, well, let's move on quickly. However, to be a bit more fair to Linnaeus, it does seem he wasn't as sold on some of these ideas himself as some of his followers and later critics were, at least in the end of his life. For example, he wasn't too convinced of his own definitions of class and order as being natural. In fact, he wasn't even sure that anything above a genus was a natural division. Or if there was a natural division, he wasn't sure that his system of definitions and criteria was accurately describing it. Later in his life, he began to doubt the usefulness of the whole system. The existence of hybrids, where two distinct species can create offspring, challenged a strict separation of species. This, along with other observations he made, caused him to suspect that the species that God had created, and remember, virtually everyone at this time believes that God had created plants and animals, were not all the same as they are today. In fact, he even speculated that the number of species alive today is larger than the number of species that were originally created, and he proposed that God created one pair per genus, and that the species we have today are descended from these genus pairs, clearly doubting Aristotle's notion of unchangeable species. One serious critique on Linnaeus' system would come from France, where Georges-Louis Leclerc de Buffon, who lived from 1707 through 1788, published his Histoire naturelle, or natural history. His main critique of Linnaeus was that life existed not in neat little groups, but on a continuum. All classifications were therefore arbitrary and cannot be anything other than a superimposed artificial structure. There was no clear distinction between one species and another, or one genus and another. Classifications, he said, could be useful, but they should be based on common sense, and should not pretend to be anything else, like some sort of intrinsic natural system. He also used to speculate, like John Ray before him, that the diversity of life came about through some form of degeneration. For example, he proposed that donkeys were a form of a degenerate horse. And though he ultimately rejected the notion, he did ponder briefly if apes could be degenerate humans. Despite Linnaeus' doubts and the Buffons' misgivings, some who followed in their footsteps continued to believe that the classification of living things was not just possible, but also a good and beautiful thing. One biologist with such a view was Louis Agassiz, who lived from 1807 through 1873. He believed that, despite the difficulties and challenges, there was an underlying system of nature, and that finding, not inventing, this natural system would prove the existence of a creator. Now, he did believe that species could adapt to their environment, but instead of calling that a degeneration or an evolution, he saw it as a secondary type of tinkering with God's blueprint for that species. But it could not change the underlying natural system which God had created. Darwin. As we have seen, the rigorous nature of a taxonomical system was already somewhat challenged before Darwin, even by Carl Linnaeus, as was the unchangeable nature of a species, as Aristotle and Plato had preached. But before Darwin and Wallace, there was no widely accepted theory of how species could change. Or, honestly, if they even could at all. Because despite Linnaeus and Ray's and other people's openness to the idea of species changing, there was still some fierce debates, with strong proponents of both the changeability and unchangeability of species. In these debates, the word degeneration was floated by a few biologists, a term that heavily implied that a changed species is a less perfect species. It borrowed from the Scala Naturae and suggested that when a species changes, it is undesirable or bad, and going from higher to lower. Now, I'm not going to explain the whole theory of evolution in this video, but one consequence of this theory is that it came with the notion of universal common descent. Namely, that all species, if you go back far enough, came from a universal common ancestor, and you could draw these lines of descent like a kind of evolutionary family tree. And just like humans, on average, look more similar to their siblings than to their cousins, and more similar to their first cousins than their second or third cousins, so species that had a more recent common ancestor would look more similar to each other than to species with which they shared a more distant common ancestor. And there you have it! This notion married taxonomy to evolution. Organisms were no longer placed in a taxon because they looked similar to other organisms in the same taxon, but because they shared a recent common ancestor. Or to put it differently, a species was now placed in genus A because it shared a common ancestor with other species of genus A that was more recent than any common ancestor from genus B or C. And genus A, B, and C were grouped together in family X because they shared a common ancestor that was more recent than with any of the genera from family Y. This changed everything. From now on, the taxonomic system had a purpose. The natural system, which was hinted at in the title of Linnaeus' book, was now discovered. Universal common descent and a theory of how new species could develop from existing ones. And now we also have a way of determining if a taxonomic system is true or false, based on the objective criteria of whether it actually shows which species or groups of species are more or less closely related. In fact, the classification system as it existed in Darwin's time already, in broad strokes, lined up with how these different species were and are believed to be related to each other. And it was precisely this rough parallel that helped to make the theory of evolution seem plausible. Or as historian Michael Morange put it, the development of a rigorous classification did not hinder the rise of an evolutionary worldview, but it made it possible. It is because living things are not in a permanent state of transformation, like the Buffon had argued, that an evolutionary history of the living world is conceivable. Two technical terms are useful to introduce here, namely a nested hierarchy and a phylogenetic tree. A nested hierarchy is taking the idea of a hierarchy, namely the idea of different levels, one higher than the other or one more general than the other, and placing branching hierarchies within them. We saw the beginning of this as far back as when terms like order and class were first introduced, and it really flourished with Linnaeus. And it truly is fascinating to think that, despite a lot of rough edges, continuous disputes about which characteristics to prioritize, and vague definitions for these groups, that taxonomists were and are able to construct the rough outlines of such a nested hierarchy, even if it took them a while to recognize it for what it is. The second term is phylogenetic tree. This is the fancy term for a taxonomical system that maps the evolutionary or ancestral relationships between species, in the form of a nested hierarchy. Today, the terms phylogenetic tree and taxonomical system are sometimes used interchangeably, or taxonomic systems are judged by how well they portray the phylogenetic tree. Though one of the main points I want to make in this video is that you can have taxonomic systems that are not phylogenetic trees if you have a different purpose in mind for them. Because this goes back all the way to the question I posed at the beginning of this video. What is the purpose of a taxonomy? And the answer of at least one school of thought among biologists today is that its purpose is to be a phylogenetic tree, although this should come with at least two massive asterisks. First, the transition from the Linnaean system to a pure phylogenetic tree has been only partial, and proponents of changing taxonomy into a pure phylogenetic tree often complain loudly that the taxonomical system needs a massive overhaul. Second, there are several ways in which a phylogenetic tree can be constructed, and biologists are still arguing about which type they prefer. But this is a complex topic, and for time's sake I will leave it at that. There's one final comment I would like to make, and that is that the ghost of Aristotle is still hidden in the word evolution. As I mentioned before, when John Ray and Carl Linnaeus floated terms like degeneration or deterioration, it conjures up the image of the scala naturae, of higher and lower beings. Well, so does the term evolution, but in the opposite direction, because these earlier taxonomists imagined that it was possible for a species to change downwards on the great chain of being, namely from higher species to a lower one, or from a perfect one as God had originally intended it or created it to be, to an imperfect one, not how God had intended it. Now with evolution the opposite image is evoked, species going from low and simple to high and complex. Replacing high versus low, or original species versus devolved species, with simple versus complex, can already be found in one of Darwin's predecessors. the French biologist and early evolutionary theorist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. How deliberate this imagery is in Darwin, I don't know, though I suspect with the 19th century Victorian culture in the background that I'm not far off the mark. But today, most biologists loudly, explicitly and repeatedly warn against any such notions. Contemporary. Though more can be said about Darwin, a lot more, there is still one major question left unanswered. How do you know if a taxonomic system accurately represents the phylogenetic tree? The short answer is that more similar species share a more recent common ancestor, and hence they should be grouped closer together. But how do you know how recent an ancestor is? Well, you look at their similarities and differences. But then we still haven't answered the question of which characteristics should be given priority. For that, we have to go to a methodology called cladistics, first developed by German entomologist Willi Hennig in 1950, summarized by Benjamin Fraser and Kim Sternley as follows. In the simplest version of the idea, the branching structure of a cladogram is drawn in whichever way requires the fewest evolutionary changes to account for the observed distribution of traits. Or as one biology textbook puts it, the pathway of evolution probably includes the fewest major events that coincide with the evidence at hand. Starting with all the homologous traits in a group of organisms, scientists look for the most obvious and simple order of evolutionary events that led to the occurrence of those traits. In short, you cannot just look at one trait or compare just two separate species, but you have to look at several species and several characteristics, and then basically apply Occam's razor. This is great, but at the same time there are potential problems and challenges as well. One potential problem is if the available data is very limited for one reason or another. But a more serious challenge is the selection of which species to compare and which sets of characteristics to analyze. Or as Richard Richards puts it, first, there are multiple algorithms with conflicting implications for classification, and no obvious reason to prefer one algorithm over another. Second, phylogeneticists do not agree about which kinds of characters to use. Molecular phylogeneticists use molecular characters. Others want to look at sexual characters. And a third group wants to look at skeletal and muscular structure characters. Which phylogenetic hypothesis most closely aligns with Occam's razor depends on which kinds of characters are chosen. Third, systematics employ the term character as if it is relatively unproblematic. But it is not clear how to individuate characters, or even what counts as a character. Because of these challenges, and because, especially for the higher taxa, biology has inherited certain classification traditions, the literature often either talks about the taxonomy needing to align more closely with the latest version of the phylogenetic tree, or they complain that it doesn't do so well enough. Or that, though evolution is important, the primary purpose of a taxonomy is to make communication easier, rather than be a perfect mapping of phylogenetic relationships. At this point, many defer to genetics. In Darwin's time, not only were genetics unknown, we didn't even know what was in a cell. Some basic microscopes were invented, so we knew that bodies were made up of cells, but we had no idea about the fascinating and beautifully complex world that exists within each of our cells, let alone DNA strands and what they mean. Now, there is a lot that can be said about genes and genetics, but here I will limit myself to the following observations. First of all, genetics play an ever greater role in determining a species' position within the phylogenetic tree and, by implication, the taxonomic system. One reason is our increased ability to analyze genes better and better with more and more sensitive equipment, an ever-growing database of already analyzed DNA samples, combined with the increasing speed and power of our supercomputers, and the fact that it gets cheaper and cheaper to sequence DNA. Another reason is that DNA is made up of strings of 4 different nucleotides. It is easy to compare two sets of DNA and slap a number of them and say that they are X% similar. At least it is easier than painstakingly and often manually comparing long lists of visible characteristics. The second thing I would like to say about genetics is that despite its promise of a more objective comparison between species, DNA comparisons still depend on human input, humans hypothesizing, and humans selecting which parts of the DNA to compare from which species or individuals. Maybe at some point in the very distant future we can feed all the DNA of every organism into a supercomputer and have an AI crank out a taxonomy for all of us. But we aren't there yet. We still have geneticists selecting relatively small portions of DNA from one species and comparing them to similar portions of DNA from another species, and then interpreting the statistical data that comes out. Humans are still the ones making sure that we are comparing apples to apples, and biologists use their experience and education to predict which comparisons are most likely to give us the most reliable answers. And the third thing I want to say here is that there are things a genetic analysis cannot tell us. For example, it cannot tell us what the DNA of an extinct species is if the DNA has degraded over time. Nor can DNA tell us if two species are of the same genus or the same family or the same order unless we first have a clear definition of what a genus or a family or an order is. This is for at least three reasons. The first reason is that the amount of genetic variation within a species differs from species to species. Humans have extremely little genetic variation among themselves compared to other mammals, and the amount and type of variation among a species of reptiles is very different from the genetic variation within a species of angiosperms or a species of bacteria. So a universal standard seems unlikely to be workable. Reason number 2. There are many species of which we have, as of yet, either no or very little genetic data. In science fiction, a biologist may carry a small field kit with them, and they can read a new species' DNA in minutes. We may get there one day, but reading an entire genome still takes a lot of time and a lot of work, not to mention the fact that there is an enormous backlog. According to one recent estimate from 2023, fewer than 1,000 species have had full DNA sequencing out of the 2.16 million that have been described so far. The third reason might be a hard pill to swallow for geneticists, but even if we were able to define a species by its genetic boundaries, and we could express it in a number or a mathematical formula, that genetic definition would be secondary to the initial or intuitive definition of species. This third point is in part what is meant by the following quote from an article by Reind and his colleagues. In the vast majority of modern descriptions associated with DNA data, tree diagrams or divergence estimates based on DNA alignments have indicated the distinctness of a species, but authors have relied on morphological or behavioral traits for the actual diagnosis. Meaning that DNA assists in the taxonomical analysis, but most biologists still almost exclusively refer to outwardly visible characteristics for the actual classification of the species. This despite the fact that there are likely cryptic species present in almost every branch of the phylogenetic tree that only DNA sequencing can expose. A cryptic species is a species that is outwardly indistinguishable from another species, and thus they are both grouped together in a single species. But a closer inspection of the DNA reveals that there is a completely different species hidden within the other species. Still, in practice it has proven challenging to use DNA analysis in setting up a proper taxonomy. Part of the problems I have already discussed, but there are also the problems with how geneticists who foray into the realm of taxonomy have often failed to, how do I say this politely, grasp the fundamental philosophical questions that underlie a proper taxonomical analysis. Alright, that wasn't very polite, but let me paraphrase the article cited earlier. Diagnoses based solely on DNA analysis, without explicit indication of how and where the DNA of one species differs from the DNA of another species are akin to statements such as, "The new species has green legs," that fail to provide a comparison to the leg color of other species. In other cases, authors have identified species on the basis of DNA differences, leading to statements such as, "New species A is 3.5% different from species B in their DNA." Such a statement is akin to saying that the leg color of two species somehow differs by 3.5%, with no indication about which specific leg colors are being referred to. And going even further, of the species that have been partially taxonomically classified, this classification process only included the analysis of a relatively small portion of their DNA. The choice for selecting this portion of DNA over that portion of DNA is, once again, both necessary due to the current limitations of supercomputers and based on the education and experience of the geneticists who selected the DNA portion because they believed that the similarities and differences in this portion of DNA would contain the most traces of the evolutionary history of that species. To once again refer to Reint and his colleagues, usually only 500 to 1200 nucleotides of the mitochondrial DNA are compared. Just to give one estimate, the average human has 6 billion nucleotides, and some species have many times that. In short, though the use of DNA in taxonomy is potentially very promising, it still requires a careful methodology and a proper understanding of the philosophical questions and presuppositions underlying the whole taxonomic system. So let us look at this final challenge next, and delve a little deeper into the various taxonomical layers and their definitions. The Linnaean system. Let's start at the bottom and the lowest taxonomical rank. Sure, some biologists want to talk about subspecies and even smaller subdivisions, but for this video I'll stick to the 8 main ones. On the one hand, species have official definitions, but on the other hand it seems species is a very natural or intuitive classification that we as humans almost automatically make. One definition is the so-called ecological definition, which states that individuals of the same species share the same ecological niche. But what if two completely different species occupy the same ecological niche and live side by side? Another very common definition is the following. A species consists of organisms that share common characteristics and are generally capable of reproducing to produce fertile offspring. Here is something important to note. I suspect most of you are familiar with this second definition, namely that members of the same species can produce fertile offspring. This definition, called the biological species concept, was first introduced by biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky and popularized by Ernst Mayr. But it has rough edges too, starting with the fact that some species like bacteria reproduce asexually, and that you cannot use it to classify extinct species. And then there are at least 2 more challenges. The first being that producing fertile offspring is something that exists on a spectrum. Sometimes 2 species cannot always produce fertile offspring, but only sometimes. Or species A and B cannot produce fertile offspring together, but both A and B can produce fertile offspring with species C. But even if we ignore these challenges, there is a practical hurdle as well. Not every species has been crossbred with every similar species. As in, though science heavily relies on experiments, in most cases, to have a new species accepted by the scientific community, you don't have to prove, by way of a long series of experiments, that this new species can indeed not produce fertile offspring with any other species. Additionally, as already mentioned earlier, a cryptic or hidden species may be present in existing species and we'll never know unless we either attempt a massive breeding campaign within the species to see who produces with who, or we do a DNA analysis. Next, I would like to note that the term species, albeit in perhaps a slightly less rigidly defined manner, is a term or a level of grouping that quite closely resembles the intuitive groupings that humans have done all over the world for thousands of years. It is just the slightly more formal definitions like the ones mentioned above that give it a level of scientific legitimacy. But if one were to go back in time and give a modern biologist a few years to analyze all the animals in, say, ancient Egypt, and then have them compare notes with a local scribe who is also a nature enthusiast, their lists of species would likely be a pretty close match. That the definition of a species is more intuitive and even a little fuzzy has long been observed by biologists. Here is a quote from a biologist you might have heard of, Charles Darwin. "I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other, and that it does not essentially differ from the term variety, which is given to less distinct and more fluctuating forms. In this situation, both the intuitive classification of species and the lack of a 100% precise definition that is accepted by most biologists is the reason that philosophers of biology continue to write chapters and articles about the species problem." And finally, the name of a species. Though many species have what you might call natural or colloquial names, formally documented species always have a binomial name made up of two Latin words. For example, Homo sapiens. The first word is always capitalized and the second word is lowercase, and both words are always in italics. The second word is the species designation and the first word is that of the genus. So it is species sapiens from the genus Homo. Genus. The basic definition of a genus, the plural of which is genera, is that it is a group of similar species. The term or the concept of genus is also quite old. It may have been used formally in antiquity, but as mentioned before, at least as far back as Gaspard Bauhin in the late 1500s, early 1600s, the term was used quite consistently. Now at this point in my research I was hoping to find a definition by which to objectively and specifically determine when two species are in the same genus or not. Even if it was a definition that wasn't always verifiable, like the crossbreeding one for species, or that it is derivative, like a DNA-based one, but I found surprisingly little. Family, order, class and phylum or division. I also found surprisingly little for all the next ones. This is probably in part due to me only having received minimal training in biology, but I also think that these levels are not as much set in stone as they at first appear. For example, I can easily understand the basic premise as follows. If I find two species that are quite similar, they are part of the same genus. If on the other hand they are not that similar, then they are part of the same family, but not the same genus. And if they are even less similar, they are part of the same order, but not the same family or genus, etc., etc. But exactly how similar two species have to be in order to be in the same order or family or genus is, I don't want to say arbitrary, but perhaps I should say that it is in large part based on which branch of the taxonomic system you are, with bacteria having very different criteria than mammals, for example. And in large part this is in turn based on how these species have been compared and classified in the past. Here too, genetics and DNA analysis can clear things up for us, but again, different branches of the tree of life will almost certainly still look very different and thus lead to very different classification criteria for fungi than for fish. Perhaps a similarity in DNA of X% in fungi will mean that they share the same genus, but a similar percentage of similarity between two fishes may merely place them in the same class. Or to put it differently, where exactly the line is between a genus, a family, an order, a class or a phylum heavily depends on how that particular branch of the taxonomic system has developed in the past and how it is described and classified in modern scientific literature. This includes how such a taxon has previously been described and diagnosed. This is also implicitly the view of Randall Schuch. Although some workers may have misconstrued the use of the family category to mean that the placement of a taxon at that level conveys some particular or essential properties, most investigators using the system in this day and age are well aware that family and all other categorical ranks are used to denote a scheme of nested hierarchical relationships, not to convey information on one additional aspect of reality over and above the characters by which they are diagnosed. Kingdoms and domains. The final two layers are kingdoms and domains. The term kingdom is quite old, and at the time of Linnaeus, living organisms were divided in two kingdoms, plants and animals. Later, several discoveries were made in both cell biology and microbiology that led to two developments. First, fungi were found to be very, very different from plants and gained a kingdom, since they seemed to roughly differ as much from plants as they did from animals. Secondly, with ever more powerful microscopes, bacteria were discovered, and they too were granted their own kingdom. Other kingdoms are the kingdom of protozoa and chromista, groups of extremely small, often single-celled organisms. These absolutely fascinating groups of organisms are very small and a little difficult to wrap your head around, so I won't attempt to describe or define them, lest I make a fool out of myself. Recently, as in 2015, the most recent kingdom was inaugurated, when it was found that the archaea, which, like bacteria, don't have a nucleus with a membrane, were found to be different enough from bacteria to be separated. In fact, they are so different that it has been argued they should not just have a separate kingdom, but a separate domain. And given the importance of cell structure, the bacteria and archaea are usually grouped together in the domain of prokaryotes, while all the rest are in the domain of eukaryotes. Not to disagree with these proposed kingdoms or domains, but did you notice my vague wording? Different enough from acts to gain a kingdom? This is in part because I'm not an expert on any of this, but also in part because, again, who is to say that this difference or this set of differences is important or large enough to warrant a new kingdom or even a new domain, rather than being merely large or important enough for a separate phylum? Why not any of the other differences? One part of the answer lies of course in the question of when an organism or a species or a genus had its most recent common ancestor. But the higher up the taxonomy one goes, the more difficult it becomes to determine that exactly. Another part of both the answer and the problem lies in accepted practices. Taxonomists working on one branch of biology will be familiar with the accepted descriptions and definitions of particular genera, families, classes, etc., and will have little trouble slotting a new taxon into the system. But the philosopher in me has to ask the meta question, namely, why are these the defining characteristics of that taxon, and why can't you expand or contract the definition of this order or that genus? And again, I believe we have to go back to the very beginning of this video. What is a taxonomy for? What is it supposed to do? The answer is, it seems, twofold. On the one hand, a good taxonomy will make it easier to communicate about a particular group by referencing long-established names for famous taxa, rather than give an elaborate description each time you want to refer to them. But on the other hand, the notion also implies particular evolutionary relationships with other groups in the same taxon or in sister taxa. Conclusion. When we first learned about taxonomy, which for most of us was likely in high school, we were taught a clear, neat and stable system of naming, classifying and ordering. Tiers and definitions were clearly defined, and there were but a few rough edges here and there, but more genetic research would surely clear everything up. In fact, that was what I was taught when I took a few undergraduate classes in biology and geology at the university I was studying. However, I always felt that something was a little off about this neat, simple presentation, and why I wanted to delve deeper into this topic. As it turns out, my suspicions were correct. Definitions are vague, undefined and perhaps even undefinable. The implied link with evolution is weak and at least partially circular in nature. And the promise of genetic analysis fixing everything eventually is still very far off and fundamentally incapable of answering several philosophical questions. And the often praised stability simply isn't absolute either. Or as one biologist put it, we must conclude that taxonomy is by its very nature not a stable enterprise, and consequently neither can be the system by which we name things that is tied to it. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to discredit or demean taxonomy or systematics. I have no problem with any of these disciplines. If anything, my appreciation for them has grown during my research. What I am questioning is the notion that taxonomic ranks are rigid and objectively found in nature. What I am challenging is a naive idea that may have inadvertently been taught to you, that the definitions of terms like species or class or phylum are clear, universal, and have never changed. And perhaps most importantly, I seriously doubt that this is the only way in which taxonomy can be done legitimately. That we should stick with the system that we have and that we don't need to think about tough philosophical questions anymore. Questions about which characteristics should be included in the construction of a taxonomy. Questions like how to prioritize and weigh the selected characteristics. Questions like, are certain characteristics prioritized or given a heavy weight because they are easier to evolve, or should we assume that they are easier to evolve because they are given a certain priority or weight in the construction of the taxonomic system and the phylogenetic tree? Meaning that the study of cladistics was useful in the past, but now that we have our answers, we never have to revisit those questions again. And finally, I am challenging the assumption that since we have a taxonomic system that has the shape of a nested hierarchy, which includes all life, that we therefore, ipso facto, as an inevitable result, have a phylogenetic tree encompassing all life that proves rather than assumes universal common descent. The underlying fact to my conclusion, namely that taxonomies can be crafted in different ways based on our assumptions and goals, can also be found in this honest though somewhat technical quote from evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. Even I, although I developed this scheme regarding a particular detail about evolution, would not go so far in trying to craft a naturalistic defense, for I recognize that the objective items in the acceptive pool could be parsed in other ways. Our decisions about their ranking and secondary ordering requires a choice among several logically legitimate alternatives. All taxonomies base such choices on the designation of a basis of primary ordering. The differences among alternative choices reflects the theories we favor as most useful in understanding and explaining the phenomena encompassed by the taxonomy. An even harsher criticism of ignoring philosophical questions like the ones I mentioned, as well as several others, comes from David Hull. A common refrain among systematists has been that, in their research, they should start with the facts and nothing but the facts, appealing to theories only as a last resort, if at all, even though philosophers of biology are committed to taking biology seriously. On this score, they depart from these biologists. No such thing as theory-free classifications are possible. Even if possible, they are not desirable. Biblical taxonomy. As I stated at the beginning, I am primarily a biblical scholar, specialized in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, so I did want to finish this video with a very brief look at what the Old Testament does with regards to taxonomy. At first glance, however, I would have to say that there isn't all that much there to work with. The Bible is primarily a religious text, and though it contains many different genres including prophetic history, legal codes, songs, proverbs, moral teachings, apocalyptic visions, letters, biography, etc., it does not contain any scientific essays. However, Hebrew and Greek, like any language spoken by humans, has a wide variety of words that refer to groups of living things. I've placed a lovely little book in the description called Fauna and Flora in the Bible from the United Bible Society. In it, they go through each word that refers to a specific group of animals or plants that is mentioned in the Bible. In some cases, a Hebrew word refers to a species. Shafan, for example, refers to the rock badger, known by its formal Latin name of Rocavia syriacus. At other times, the Hebrew language is less precise. For example, the Hebrew word nesher can refer to the imperial eagle, the golden eagle, or the griffin vulture. In Latin, Aquila heliaca, Aquila chrysaetus, and Gyps fulvus. As you can see, 3 different species from 2 different genera. And at other times, a word seems to refer to an even broader group. Nemala is commonly translated as ant, and it is generally believed to refer to the harvester ant, or Messer semirufus. but I see no particular reason why it couldn't be applied to the whole family of Formicidae. If anything, I might critique this otherwise very helpful book of being a bit over-specific, even if the underlying linguistic, ecological and paleontological research is sound. But besides words that refer to a species or somewhat larger groups of animals and plants, Hebrew also has words that refer to larger taxa of an informal or practical kind. Words like tzon or eder, for example, are often translated with flock or herd, and both can refer to a flock of sheep, of goats, or of sheep and goats, and in some cases eder can even include cows or oxen. As you can see, these words, like their English equivalents, can be used rather loosely and informally and are just one of those malleable parts of any language. In all this, a few interesting sections do stand out and deserve a bit more attention. Let's start with the dietary laws of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. These are two places where the author is deliberately grouping animals together. Before looking at two examples, there are two things that you need to keep in mind. 1. Usage and context determine the meaning of a word. The ancient Hebrews did not carry around dictionaries to look up the meaning of a word. They would look at how a word was used in context and grasp both meaning and nuance from there. 2. The author uses words, definitions and selection criteria that were already in use by the audience. This means that the author wasn't giving new definitions and criteria by which to classify animals, but used words and practices already familiar to the ancient Israelites. The first selection criteria for distinguishing animals they were and were not allowed to eat is a dual one, namely animals that have a hoof that is cloven in two, and animals that chew the cud. It then divides various land animals in 4 groups, namely those that have a cloven hoof and chew the cud, those that do not have a cloven hoof but do chew the cud, those that do have a cloven hoof but do not chew the cud, and implied but unmentioned are animals that have neither a cloven hoof nor chew the cud. The chewing of the cud is sometimes understood as rumination. The Hebrew term is ma'alath gerah. Ma'alath is a Hebrew participle form of too technical. The first word is derived from the verb alah, which means to go up. In this form, it means causing to go up or bringing up. And the second word is only used in this context and is usually understood as the content of the stomach. A rough translation then could be something like those who bring up the contents of their stomach, which then easily leads to an identification with the suborder of Ruminantia. But what on earth do the rock badger and the hare among the Ruminantia? Well, in short, just like we, in our everyday language, classify tomatoes as vegetables or spiders as insects, so it seems did the ancient Israelites. Colloquially, they included the rock badger among the Ruminantia because it makes very similar mouth movements and sounds. And the hare is also included in this group, since they occasionally eat their droppings. Another common observation is that the bat, or the atalev, is included among the oaf, or the winged ones. Wait, that's not what it says in my Bible. It says bird. Well, yes, but in this case, bird is not a translation of the word oaf, but an approximation, as the word oaf is clearly derived from the word oof, which means flying. So, oaf includes birds, including the ostrich, but also the bat and flying insects, because they all have wings. There is, however, one section in the Bible that seems to contain slightly more technical language, and it has the potential for including somewhat more abstract terms, and that is Genesis 1. For example, we find the word oaf again, but we also encounter expressions like plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed when discussing the creation of plants. Sea creatures are described as swarming things or swarmers. And 3 broad groups of land animals are described as livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the earth. This looks like 3 very, very broad taxa, if they could be called that. And finally, there is one even broader group of creatures, namely those that have the breath of life. Perhaps a very rough parallel to vertebrates. But there is a word used here, as well as in the flood story and in the chapters on dietary laws, that I have so far avoided, and that is the word min, spelled mem hirek yod nun. Not to be confused with the preposition min, which is spelled mem hirek nun, but min is often translated as kind, and sometimes as type or sort, and it is applied to plants and animals alike. Some creationists have taken the way this word is used as an indication that this refers to species or genus, or some other clearly defined taxonomic rank. But there are at least 3 problems with that. First of all, as I have already demonstrated, taxonomists don't fully agree on the precise definition of species, and any of the higher taxa are even more disputed and vaguely defined. Secondly, though the word may refer to a taxon of related species in Genesis 1, usage defines meaning, so it isn't necessarily or immediately certain that the word means the exact same thing in the flood story and the dietary laws as it does in Genesis 1. Thirdly, if we assume that min does refer to a taxon of related species that are not related to other species, and thus denying universal common descent in the process, Genesis 1 and the Hebrew language as a whole give us virtually no clues as to the number, definitions or limitations of such a min, or paramin as some creationists have come to call it. Some creationists have met these and other challenges and have begun the process of creating their own alternative taxonomies, using the word min or paramin as an inspiration. They have attempted to describe inclusionary and exclusionary criteria, along with their own phylogenetic trees, plural, of the lower taxa, while denying that above a certain level the different taxa are evolutionarily related. Now, as I'm writing this script, I see that I'm already on page 19, which likely makes this video well over an hour long, so I'll just put a few additional resources in the description and not delve any further into the various creationist taxonomies and their histories here. And that was our first introduction into biological taxonomy. Before wrapping up, I would like to thank an old friend of mine, William Stone. William has a PhD and many years of experience as a researcher, has frequently published on taxonomy and was kind enough to help me out by sending me some resources as well as thorough feedback on an earlier version of this script. While researching this topic, I came across so many other super interesting subjects that could be whole videos by themselves. For example, I could delve much deeper into the history of taxonomy and highlight different ideas of degeneration prior to Darwin, or discuss some very interesting debates in the early 19th century. Or I could delve more into different types of phylogenetic trees, and why it has proven so difficult to create a proper phylogenetic tree, and the different proposals for how to fix taxonomy once and for all. Or I could delve into creationistic taxonomies, including the baraminology I talked about near the end of this video. Or maybe you have another proposal or a question about taxonomy and the creation-evolution debate. There is still so much to explore, even in this little corner of the debate. Let me know in the comments if you want a taxonomy part 2 and what it should be about. Also check out the resources in the description if you want to do more research by yourself. The next video on this topic will deal with the philosophy of science, and we will specifically look at Karl Popper and his criteria of verification and falsification.